Hello everyone, welcome back once again to Seattle Civil War Legacy. I'm Richard, and today we're here once again in Seattle's Grand Army of the Republic Cemetery. You can see the 1911 monument to the GR veterans behind me here that's in the focal sort of central point of the cemetery. There's just under 500 veterans buried here. It's, of course, makes for lots of history, the history of the cemetery, the history of the veterans as a group, and of course the history of the veterans individually. And that's why we're here today, because I want to have a little introduction to you all of one veteran who's become kind of one of my favorites. Really, it's hard to have favorites among historical figures on a local level like this that you're studying. But the gentleman here in front of me, I'll come down and point out to you, is Lieutenant Topping S Winchell. He served in the 10th, 38th, and 50th Wisconsin Infantry. He was a corporal in the 10th, sergeant in the 38th, and just before the close of the war was appointed lieutenant in the 50th. He served from 1862 until muster out, and then later in 1865. The 50th served in Kansas in the Dakota Territory, so he had been previously in the Eastern Theater with the 10th, with the 38th, and with the 10th he was in the Western Theater, so he actually kind of saw a little bit of everything in the war. But the reason I say he's one of my favorites is because of his, I want to say, bigger-than-life personality. A lot of these guys certainly have larger-than-life stories, larger-than-life histories, unbelievable accounts of what they went through in the war, what they accomplished or achieved in Seattle, the hardships, the sort of the triumphs that they experienced by coming out here and building a life for themselves in the 1880s, 90s, early 1900s. But the interesting thing about Topping Winchell, who actually went by Tip Winchell, that's how anyone in Seattle in the early 1900s, probably, or 1890s for that matter, probably would have known him. He received a lot of coverage in the paper because, well, let's back up. So after the war, he was native of Wisconsin, born 1842, served in 3 Wisconsin regiments, the 10th in 1862. He was mustered out of that regiment, or discharged for disability, in October of 1862. The first engagement that regiment was in was Perryville in October of 1862. Without having access to his compiled service records, it's hard to know exactly what the discharge was. It was related to anything. He doesn't show up in any records as far as being wounded. So maybe he was discharged from illness. There's any number of illnesses that could have afflicted a Civil War soldier that would have gotten them a discharge by disability like that. He re-enlists in 1864, March of 1864, with the 38th Wisconsin, which went east, and it arrived just in time to participate as pickets and guarding trains for Cold Harbor. And then after that battle, they went with the 9th Corps in the Army of James, the 9th Corps in the Army of the Potomac, across the James River. They were in Petersburg. Most notably in his military history was that he was in Company D of the 38th Wisconsin. And the first 4 companies, they were split into 2 battalions because after they had recruited enough men to form the first 2 companies, the bounty offers for enlistment stopped, so recruitment basically fell off. So they were combined with some other elements that were recruited for other things to form. So it was a regiment. It was a 38th Wisconsin, but it was sort of 2 separate battalions, and they wound up in 2 different places. The first battalion, companies A, B, C, and D, that would include at that time Sergeant Winchell, was one of the very front-line units to go in the lead attack in the Battle of the Crater in Petersburg. If you've seen the movie Cold Mountain, the beginning of the movie, they show the Union soldiers, the Pennsylvania men, digging a mine. They pack it full of TNT. gunpowder, everything. They blow up a big section of the Confederate fortifications, and then they show Union soldiers rushing in. It's most famous probably for the African American troops of the U.S. CT that went in. That's one of the more noteworthy aspects. But the 37th and 38th Wisconsin were the first to go into the crater. That would have included Sergeant Tip Winchell. He does get promoted in February of 1864 to lieutenant and gets transferred to the 50th Wisconsin. In his 1890 veterans pensions schedule survey, census, so to speak, it does list Lieutenant Winchell as having a gunshot wound in the groin that required that he would wear a truss to support himself. So he was wounded at some point. I don't know when. Like I said, without the compiled service records, there doesn't seem to be any engagement he would have been involved in 1862, unless he did get wounded at Perryville and then immediately got discharged. More likely it was the crater or something involved in Petersburg. So then he returns to Wisconsin. The immediate post-war years, he winds up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He's very, very active in the GAR and 10th Wisconsin reunions, things like that afterwards. 1889, he makes it to Seattle. The first 10 years he's in Seattle. He works for a streetcar line, eventually working his way up to being superintendent of, let's see here, it was the 3rd Street Railway, I believe. Excuse me, looking at my notes here. Yep, the 3rd Street line of the railway. So he did that from 1889 till for about 10 years, 10 or 12 years. And then he became, in a controversial matter, he became the bailiff for the Seattle Municipal Police Court. So he was the policeman that sort of kept things under control, kept things flowing, handled the people that were being there on charges, dealing with, getting people to the right place for their fines, that kind of thing. He performed that job for about 15 years, literally until the day that he died in 1914. But what is interesting and why we have such a great understanding of Tip Winchell as a guy is because the newspapers offered a lot of coverage in a very, very entertaining, very rich way of writing about the happenings in the police court. They really play up the characters. They really tell the stories. They add a lot of, not exaggeration, but it's very rich. The storytelling that the writers that covered the police court do is incredibly readable and entertaining. And Bailiff Tip Winchell appears in a lot of the stories that involve the criminal cases, things that involve Tip himself. He was notorious for restoring order to the court or handling situations with he had this, they talk about this glare that he had, that he would look at people and you better knock it off, whatever you're going to do, stop it. He had a very famous finger wag, things like that. He was a very gregarious, bigger than life, very friendly. He was friends with all the press corps that would hang out there, and he was a really well-known guy, super active in the Grand Army of the Republic. He was a Stevens Post commander. He was the treasurer of the Department of Washington and Alaska, I believe, treasurer, adjutant maybe, something like that. He would travel for the national encampments. Like I mentioned earlier, the 10th Wisconsin, which is strangely the unit, he took a lot of pride in his military background, and it was the 10th Wisconsin that he really identified with, more so than the 38th or the 50th. 50th was probably the least of which, because the war was essentially done when they sent him out to the Dakota Territory. And with the 38th and the crater and the siege of Petersburg, maybe he wasn't as fond of that time as he was with the early years in camp and the fun and no battles and the camaraderie of all the young volunteers in the 10th. So he was still really active in their veterans affairs and reunions and those kind of things. You see his name show up a lot in the rosters and that stuff for the 10th. So he was a super outgoing guy, and he's one of the veterans that you get enough of a personal sense of who the guy was, not just what he did, where he worked, how many years he was there, what address he lived at, what he did in the war. And I think what I'd like to do with him is, because the stories are so numerous and so entertaining about his happenings. He's almost like a comedy TV show character in a way, like on Night Court or something. He would make a good bailiff on a TV comedy sitcom like that. So there's tons and tons of stories, and I think maybe each week or every couple weeks we'll do a little feature on time with Tip Winchell, and tell some of the really entertaining stories, because we don't get that with these veterans very much. And I think I'd like to work on sharing that on a more consistent basis, because it'll take a while to get through all the Tip Winchell stories, that's for sure. So in 1914 he passed away. Was buried here. This row, this section of the cemetery tends to be they're buried basically by year of death here, starting from this way and kind of progressing this way. This is 1912, 1914, 1915 here. He was 1914. Many of the others in this section were also 1914. So his funeral was actually kind of a big deal here. Of course, all his GR friends were here. The police came out. He had served briefly as a policeman, I believe, before taking the bailiff position, and they had a choir here that was singing, providing music for his funeral. His funeral was definitely an above average event for this cemetery, and especially for a Civil War veteran. It seemed it got quite an it was quite an event in the city, funeral-wise, at that point. Another interesting thing about Winchell is when he became bailiff in 1892. He had, no, it had to be later than that. Anyway, whatever the year was, he had a bit of a interesting situation in getting the position, because there was already another veteran that had the position, and there was a lot of politics involved. Whether he was motivated party in creating this situation in which he sort of took over the bailiff position, and the other super well established Civil War veteran guy that had actually been in Seattle since 1866. He's probably the first one. He was the bailiff before Tip Winchell. He got the boot. Winchell got the job. There was a split in the GAR along lines. Who was a Tip Winchell guy, who was a Warren Perigo guy, and that's a story all to itself. But it's like I said, it's a rich, personable history. He's got a huge, warm personality, funny guy, big character, and he's unique because we know that about him. We can read what they wrote about him. Is the tribute to him when he died from the newspaper writer who covered the police court is fantastic to read. You can really sense the fondness the writer had for Tip. So he basically worked himself to death in 1914. The day before he died, he told Frank Clark, another veteran here, that the job as bailiff was getting too hard. The Mondays and Tuesdays duty was wearing him down. He didn't know how much more he could do it. He told him that night that he was going to be quitting the job within days or even hours, according to Frank Clark. And that night he would pass away. So clearly the work and the stress and the life of a wounded Civil War veteran that came west and worked and built up his life out here, wasn't easy. And he definitely kind of, I don't want to say paid a price, but he, that's ultimately what wore him down. It wasn't a disease. He didn't die of heart attack or something like that. It was basically just sort of exhaustion and overwork that eventually he just succumbed to, and he knew it, and he was telling his friends about it at the time, right before it happened. So interesting guy, real easy to connect with. Wanted to get you guys understanding who this guy was and get an idea that all these people had lives like that in Seattle. They all had personalities. They all did important stuff. They did small stuff. There's at the end of this row, there's a 97th New York guy who came here, retired with his family. Just kind of a older retired Seattle guy, bailiff. At the other end of the row, there's another 97th New York soldier who was a house painter, and he had left his family behind in New York, and he basically died destitute across the street in Lakeview. Guys that made millions of dollars in investments and railroads and real estate, and so there's the whole spectrum of them, and they all had something to say in the building and creating of the city of Seattle. So anyway, that's Tip Winchell. Hope you enjoyed a little introduction to him, and I hope you look forward to hearing a little steady doses of bailiff tip stories. Maybe keep you entertained and keep posts going between the bigger research posts. So anyway, that's it. Hope you enjoyed. Hope any of you watching that live here in the Seattle area can come out. If anybody wants to come out for a little walk around and a tour, I'm happy to come out and we can tell you the history of the cemetery, pick out some soldiers' stories to talk to you about. Remember, in late June, I'm going to be doing a tour of the Bothell Civil War veterans, and then some others over the course of summer after that. So anyway, thanks for watching. Take care.